The splintered wood of the barn door groaned under her weight as she sagged against it, one hand clutching a blood-soaked tear in her dress, the other gripping the leather handle of a heavy satchel. He stood in the amber light of a single lantern, a silhouette of lean muscle and wary stillness, the rifle in his hands held with the casual familiarity of a third limb. Dust motes danced in the light between them, each a silent witness to her desperation. Her breath came in ragged bursts, tearing at the heavy silence of his isolated world. His face, carved by years of prairie wind and disappointment, was unreadable, his eyes shadowed by the brim of a worn hat. He hadn't spoken a word since she'd stumbled out of the darkness and into his life, a ghost chased by demons he wanted no part of. She had to make him understand. She had to make him care. Her voice, when it came, was a raw whisper, scraped from the bottom of her soul. "Please," she rasped, "you have to help me." He remained silent, a statue of stone and suspicion. Panic clawed at her throat. She pushed herself upright, ignoring the searing pain in her side. She was a tall woman, broad-shouldered and built for work, not for running, and she used every inch of her height to project a strength she did not feel. "I need a husband," she stated, the word sounding insane even to her own ears. Right now his expression didn't flicker. She took a staggering step forward, the floorboards crying out beneath her boots. Her gaze locked with his, and she offered him the only currency she had left, a shocking, desperate bargain. A smirk, broken and brittle, touched her lips. "Take me as yours," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial hush that was both a plea and a challenge. "And I'll call you Daddy." His name was Caleb, and the land around him was a monument to his solitude. He'd buried his wife and daughter on the small rise overlooking the creek 5 years ago, and with them, he'd buried his heart. He didn't want a new wife, especially not one who appeared out of the night like a storm-tossed wreckage, bleeding and talking madness. The rifle felt cold and solid in his hands, a comfort against the chaos she brought into his barn. He finally spoke, his voice dry as summer dust. "Get off my land," but there was a tremor in her eyes, a terror so profound it went beyond mere fear of him. She shook her head, a small, desperate motion. "I can't," she breathed. "He'll find me." Her name, she said, was Lena. Her husband was dead, murdered just 2 days prior. The man responsible was Silas Thorne, a name that landed in the quiet barn like a rattlesnake. Caleb's body tensed with recognition. Thorne owned the valley, the water, the bank, and from the looks of it, the law. He was a cancer on the territory, one Caleb had learned long ago was best left undisturbed. "What does Thorne want with you?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. Lena's gaze dropped to the satchel clutched in her white-knuckled fist. "This," she said simply. "It was my husband's. It holds the truth about Thorne. Everything he's done. I won't let him have it." She looked up, her eyes pleading. "He's hunting a lone widow. It's easy sport. But a married woman. That's different. That's property. It complicates things. It buys me time." Caleb stared at her, the sheer audacity of her plan warring with the instinctual caution that had kept him alive. It was a fool's gambit, a paper shield against a forest fire. And yet, the name Thorne echoed with the ghosts of his own past, a debt of pain that had never been settled. He wanted to say no. The word was on his tongue, a fortress wall he was ready to raise against her. His life was quiet, predictable, and safe in its crushing loneliness. Inviting her in was inviting Thorne's wrath, a force that had broken far stronger men than him. He lowered the rifle, but his posture remained rigid. "I'm not your man," he said, the words flat and final. "Find another." Lena's face crumpled, the last of her fight seeming to drain away. "There is no other," she whispered, her voice thick with defeat. "Your ranch is the last place for 50 miles." Not under Thorne's thumb. Just as she spoke, a sound cut through the night, the distant but distinct rhythm of approaching horses, too many for a casual rider. Panic, cold and sharp, flashed in Lena's eyes. Caleb heard it too. His head snapped toward the sound, every nerve ending screaming a warning. These weren't neighbors. Not at this hour. He grabbed Lena's arm, his touch rough with urgency, and shoved her toward the dark corner behind a stack of hay bales. "Not a sound," he hissed, his own heart suddenly pounding against his ribs. He doused the lantern, plunging the barn into near-total darkness, and moved to a crack in the wall. 3 riders pulled up just beyond the fence line, their shapes menacing under the pale moonlight. One of them, a man Caleb recognized as Thorne's brutish foreman, scanned the property with a predator's gaze. "She couldn't have gone far," the man growled, his voice carrying on the still night air. "Check the ridges at first light. Thorne wants her found. And he wants what she's carrying." They wheeled their horses around and disappeared back into the darkness. The silence they left behind was heavier than before, filled with the unspoken truth of Lena's story. Caleb turned from the wall, his decision made not in his head, but in his gut. It was a choice forged in old hatreds and a flicker of forgotten honor. He looked toward the hay bales. "The preacher is a day's ride from here," he said into the darkness. "We leave at dawn." The journey to the town of redemption was a silent affair. Caleb rode ahead, a stoic sentinel, while Lena followed, the precious satchel tied securely to her saddle. The landscape was vast and unforgiving, a reflection of the chasm between them. The preacher, a tired man with watery eyes who looked like he'd officiated more funerals than weddings, asked no questions. He simply took Caleb's silver dollars, mumbled the requisite words over them in a dusty, disused chapel, and signed the certificate that bound them together. The document felt both absurd and monumental, a flimsy piece of paper that was now their only shield. On the ride back, Lena watched the rigid line of Caleb's back. He was a man locked within himself, and she was an intruder in his fortress of grief. When they arrived at the ranch, he gestured toward the small, tidy house. "You can take the bedroom," he said, his tone devoid of emotion. "I'll sleep in the barn." It was a declaration of boundaries, a reminder that their arrangement was a contract, not a comfort. The first few days passed in a quiet, awkward rhythm. Lena, her wound now cleaned and bandaged, proved her worth. She mended fences with a competence that surprised him, cooked meals with a quiet efficiency, and moved about his space with a gentle respect for his solitude. She was strong, this giant widow, but he saw the exhaustion in her eyes, the way she would sometimes stare at the horizon, her hand drifting unconsciously toward the hidden satchel. One evening, he found her by the creek, washing clothes. She looked up as he approached, her expression wary. He didn't speak, simply handed her a small, carved bird, its wooden form worn smooth with time. "It was my daughter's," he said, his voice thick. It was the first crack in his armor, a tiny offering of his own broken past. Lena took it, her fingers tracing its delicate shape. "Thank you," she whispered. It was a beginning. The illusion of peace was shattered a week later. Sheriff Brody, a man whose spine was made of jelly and whose loyalty was paid for by Silas Thorne, rode up to the ranch. He tipped his hat to Lena, his eyes lingering with a thinly veiled curiosity, before turning his attention to Caleb. "Caleb," he said, affecting a friendly tone. "Just wanted to let you know, the co-op ain't buying from you this season." "Seems there was a clerical error with your account." Caleb's jaw tightened. There was no error. It was Thorne, tightening the noose. "And the feed store in town," Brody continued, avoiding Caleb's gaze, "they seem to have misplaced your credit line." Tough break. He was delivering a threat wrapped in condolences. This was how Thorne operated, not with bullets at first, but with strangulation. He would isolate them, starve them out, make their alliance so costly that Caleb would throw Lena to the wolves to save himself. After Brody left, a heavy silence fell between them. Caleb stared out at his cattle, his entire livelihood now worthless. He could feel Lena's eyes on him, waiting for him to break, to tell her the deal was off. Instead, he turned and walked to the smokehouse. He began sharpening his knives. "We'll butcher a steer," he said, his voice a low growl of defiance. "And you'll find a way to preserve the meat. We'll live off the land." "He wants to starve us?" "We won't starve." For the first time, Lena saw a fire in him that matched her own. She nodded, a sense of shared purpose blooming in the barren soil of their arrangement. "There's an old trade route north of here," she said, her mind already working. "Goes to the mining camps. They'll pay in gold for fresh meat. It's a long haul, but we can do it." Together the word hung in the air between them, no longer just a legal term, but a promise. That night, a storm rolled in, the wind howling around the small house like a hungry wolf. The weather mirrored the turmoil inside Caleb. He was risking everything for a woman he barely knew, for a fight he hadn't chosen. He needed to understand. He found her in the main room, sitting by the cold hearth, the leather satchel on her lap. Her silhouette was framed by a flash of lightning, making her seem both powerful and terribly vulnerable. "I need to see it," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I need to know what's worth all this." Lena looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable in the flickering light. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, she unbuckled the straps. She didn't hand him the satchel. Instead, she opened it and took out a thick, leather-bound ledger. She laid it on the rough-hewn table between them. Caleb leaned forward, his lantern casting a pool of light on the page. It was filled with meticulous, handwritten entries. Names, dates, and figures, all recorded in a steady, precise hand. It wasn't just a record of Thorne's business, it was a confession. It detailed every fraudulent land deed, every extorted water right, every strong-armed buyout that had built Thorne's empire. It was a tapestry of cruelty woven over 2 decades. He saw the name Miller, a family who'd lost their ranch after their well mysteriously went dry. He saw the name Garcia, who'd been run out after a fire destroyed their crop. And then, he saw it. A single entry, dated 6 years ago. Caleb Martin. Acquisition of water rights, North Creek. Price, 1 daughter's life. The air left his lungs. The fever that took his little Sarah. It wasn't fate. It was Thorne, diverting the creek to feed his own vast herds, leaving everyone downstream with stagnant, diseased water. The ledger was not just the story of Lena's loss. It was the story of his. He looked up at Lena, and in her eyes, he saw not a stranger, but a fellow survivor. His fight was now her fight. Her war was now his. The ledger changed everything. It transformed their defensive alliance into a righteous crusade. But they were still just 2 people against an army. "This book is useless if it's just us who see it," Lena said, her voice steely with a newfound resolve. "Thorne controls the judges, the sheriff. We need more." Caleb nodded, his mind already turning. "There are others," he said slowly. "People who hate Thorne as much as we do. But they're scared." Broken, he was thinking of Old Man Hemlock, who'd lost his farm over a manufactured debt. The widow Schmidt, whose son was serving time on false charges after refusing to sell Thorne his grazing land. These were the quiet supporters, the embers of dissent waiting for a wind to fan them into flame. Over the next week, they moved with purpose. Under the cover of darkness, Caleb would ride out, a phantom visiting the broken homes scattered across the valley. He wouldn't show them the ledger, not at first. He would just talk, reminding them of what they'd lost, planting a seed of possibility. Lena, meanwhile, used the trade route to the mining camps. She sold their meat, but she also listened. She gathered stories, names, and grievances, weaving a network of shared pain. They decided to call a meeting. A secret gathering in Caleb's barn, the very place their story had begun. The night was moonless and tense. One by one, they came, ghosts from the past materializing in the lantern light. Old Man Hemlock, the widow Schmidt with her 2 remaining sons, a half-dozen other ranchers and farmers, their faces etched with fear and a desperate, flickering hope. Caleb stood before them, Lena at his side. He held up the ledger. "This is Silas Thorne," he said, his voice ringing with conviction. "Not the man who greets you in town, but the thief who stole your lives. Here is the proof. He's strong because he keeps us apart, afraid, and alone. But he can't break all of us. Not if we stand together." Word of the secret meeting traveled faster than they'd hoped. Thorne's network of spies was everywhere, and the whispers of rebellion reached his ears. The ledger, once a private threat, was now a public danger. Thorne could no longer rely on slow strangulation. He needed to cut the head off the snake. He dispatched his foreman, the brutal man Caleb had seen that first night, with a simple, chilling order: burn the ranch to the ground, retrieve the ledger, and leave no witnesses. The storm that had been brewing on the horizon for days finally broke, unleashing a torrent of rain and fury upon the valley. It was the perfect cover for an attack. Inside the house, the small band of allies cleaned their rifles, their faces grim. They knew Thorn was coming. The quiet supporters in town had sent a boy with a warning. "They're riding out," he'd panted, "a dozen of them, at least." Caleb stood by the window, watching the rain lash against the glass. He looked at Lena, who was loading shells into a shotgun with steady hands. The fear was there, a cold knot in his stomach, but something else was there too, a sense of rightness, of purpose. He had spent years hiding from the world, and now he was at the center of it, defending not just his land, but his future. He walked over to her and placed his hand over hers, stilling her movements. Their eyes met. In that moment, all the unspoken words, the shared struggles, the slowly growing affection, coalesced into a single, powerful truth. He was no longer just her protector, she was no longer just his fugitive. They were partners. "Whatever happens," he said, his voice low and certain. "We face it together." She turned her hand over, lacing her fingers with his. "Together," she affirmed. The sound of hoofbeats, muffled by the driving rain, grew closer. The final battle was about to begin. The first shot shattered the night, splintering the wood of the window frame next to Caleb's head. The siege had begun. Thorn's men, cloaked in oilskins and darkness, advanced on the house from all sides. Inside, Caleb, Lena, and their 5 allies returned fire, turning the small farmhouse into a fortress. The air grew thick with gunpowder smoke and the deafening roar of gunfire. For an hour, the battle raged, a chaotic symphony of violence and desperation. The widow Schmidt's sons fought with the fury of men defending their last chance at justice, while old man Hemlock, his hands trembling but his aim true, fired with the cold precision of a man with nothing left to lose. Lena fought alongside them, a pillar of strength, moving from window to window, her shotgun barking defiance into the storm. Then, during a lull in the fighting, a new figure appeared on horseback, silhouetted against the lightning-streaked sky. It was Silas Thorn himself, flanked by his foreman. He had come to oversee the final victory. "Caleb Martin." Thorn's voice boomed, cutting through the wind and rain. "It's over. Give me the book and the woman, and I'll let your friends walk away." Caleb looked at Lena. He saw no fear in her eyes, only resolve. "Never," Caleb yelled back. Thorn laughed, a cruel, arrogant sound. "Then you all die." Just as he gave the order to his men to charge, another group of riders appeared, emerging from the woods behind Thorn. It was Sheriff Brody, and with him were a dozen deputized townsmen, the quiet supporters, no longer silent. Brody had finally been pushed too far, his dormant conscience awakened by the community's unified stand. "Silas Thorn," Brody shouted, his voice shaky but clear. "You're under arrest for conspiracy and murder." Thorn stared, his face a mask of disbelief as his power evaporated before his eyes. His foreman made a move for his gun, but old man Hemlock's rifle cracked, and the man fell from his horse. Thorn was surrounded, his reign of terror finished not by a single hero, but by the collective will of the people he had wronged. In the aftermath, the storm passed, leaving the world washed clean. The rising sun broke through the clouds, casting a golden light over the valley. The ledger, its pages holding the weight of so many lives, was handed over to federal marshals who arrived with Sheriff Brody, its truth now irrefutable. Thorn's empire crumbled like a house of cards, his assets seized, his network of corrupt officials exposed. Justice, slow and hard won, had finally come to the territory. Caleb and Lena stood on the porch of the bullet-scarred farmhouse, looking out over the land. The air smelled of wet earth and new beginnings. The other ranchers had returned to their homes, no longer broken victims but architects of their own future. Caleb's ranch was damaged, but it was still standing. It felt different now, not a refuge for his grief, but a foundation for something new. He turned to Lena, really seeing her in the clear morning light. The desperate, hunted woman who had stumbled into his barn was gone. In her place stood a leader, a partner, a woman of incredible strength and grace. The smirk she had worn that first night, a brittle mask for her fear, was replaced by a genuine, gentle smile. "Our contract is fulfilled," she said softly, though there was no intention of leaving in her voice. "Thorn is gone. I'm free." Caleb reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers wrapping around hers. The paper shield of their marriage had been forged into something real and unbreakable in the fires of their struggle. "This was never about a contract," he said, his voice filled with an emotion he thought he'd buried forever. "This is your home now, Lena. If you'll have it." She leaned her head against his shoulder, her height a perfect match for his. "I'll have it," she whispered. Together, they watched the sun climb higher, illuminating a future they would build, not as a fugitive and a protector, but as husband and wife. Thank you so much for watching. We pour our hearts into these stories, and it means the world to us that you took the time to listen. If you enjoyed this journey, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing to the channel for more tales of drama, romance, and resilience. We love hearing from our viewers, so let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. Your support helps us keep creating the content you love. Until next time, take care.